A little bit of refactoring, I guess. Actually, today we're gonna create a ton of things. We're gonna create a structure containing the data of our tiles. We're gonna create a wrapper around the InstancedStaticMeshComponent. We're gonna create a new function library, move code around here and there, and a bunch of other things. And all that without changing anything of the current mechanic or behavior of the game. So let's get to it. Okay, so since this video is not gonna be the most interesting one, I'm not gonna explain everything, we're just gonna cover the essentials, and I'm gonna go a little bit faster than usual, because I mean, there's not much to say. So let's go, I'm gonna go in my grid folder and open the utilities folder. In there I'm going to create a new blueprint, a blueprint class, which is gonna be an actor. This blueprint is gonna be the wrapper around the instance mesh component. The reason why I'm using an actor is just because it's gonna be easier to debug in the future. I'm going to name it bp_grid mesh inst for grid mesh instance. Then I can open it. Here in the viewport, I'm gonna start by adding a new component, so instance mesh component, and drag it on top of the default scene root to remove it. Then compile save, and we can go to the graph. Here I'm just going to disable the tick by using a set actor tick enable in the begin play like so. Or you can also do it in the class default in the top right corner right here, start with tick enabled and uncheck this checkbox. But I prefer doing it in the graph just because it's more visual than changing the class defaults. And we can now jump to the wrapper functions. So create a new function, which I'm gonna name add instance, which we're gonna use to add instances to our instance static mesh component. So let's start with that. I'm gonna drag the static mesh component and do an add instance on it. Then I can drag the transform onto the function node and connect it. I'm going to rename the variable for transform instead of instance transform. And at the same time we're adding instances to our end component, we're also going to add them into an array of indexes. That way we can map back from the index of the tiles to the instance on our grid. And I'm gonna show you with an example in 2 seconds. But first create the variable. So new variable, which I'm gonna name instance indexes. Then for the variable type, I'm going to change it for int point, and I'm gonna make it an array. Then I'm gonna drag the instance indexes in the graph, do an add on it, connect it after the add instance, and connect it back to the function node. I'm gonna rename it index and swap them, just because I think it's nicer that way. And now it's time to show you why we're doing this. Well, okay, let's start by copy pasting this node right here. And let's say we want to remove an instance from the component. So let's remove instance like so. And what we need to remove an instance is an index. The index of the instance that is on the component. But there's no mapping between the index on the component and, let's say, the index on our grid. So that's why we're using a second array, this array right here, which is going to act as mapping between the index on our grid and the index of the array here. So I'm just gonna copy paste my array right here and do a find on it. Find item. And now I can pass it the index that we receive as input and feed it into the remove instance. So it's really just creating a mapping between the index of our grid and the index of the array, containing the instances of the instance static mesh component. So perfect, we have a bit of code right here. I'm just gonna collapse it into another function for the remove function. So collapse into function. I'm gonna name it remove instance, and I'm gonna open it. I'm gonna make sure everything's connected properly. I'm going to rename the input to index instead. After removing the instance, I'm also going to remove it from the array, so remove here. So both arrays are the same, so remove item, we're gonna remove the index like so. And we're actually just going to remove the instance if it exists in the array, so I'm just gonna do a contain first, so contain item like so, and an if here. So that way we check if the instance is in the array, and if it's the case, we're removing it. Perfect. Now that this function is created, I'm just going to go back in add instance and I'm gonna call it before calling the add instance. That way, when we are adding a new instance to our grid, we're gonna first remove it. So if we were already using that index, it's going to remove it and then re-add it, which is pretty much the same thing as just updating the transform in this case. We're gonna create a third function. This one is for the clear instance, so clear instances. I'm going to grab my static mesh, do a clear instances on it. Like so, and I'm also going to clear the instances in my array, so clear the array. And we're gonna need a last function to initialize the visual of our static mesh component. So the static mesh, the material, the collisions, everything else. So I'm just going to create a new function. I'm gonna name it initialize grid mesh inst, and we're gonna initialize everything. So grab the static mesh, do a set mesh, set static mesh, then set material. We can connect them back to the beginning of the function, like so. Then I'm also going to update the color on my material, so I'm going to do a set vector parameter value on materials, like so. The parameter name is going to be color. And the last thing I'm going to set is the collision, so set collision enabled, like so, connected at the end. And then we can simply connect everything back into the beginning of the function. So the static mesh, the material, for the color I'm going to convert it, so to color, like so, and the collision at the end. I'm gonna rename the variable real quick, so mesh, material, color, and collision. Perfect, let's compile, save, and I think that's it for this blueprint. Actually, I forgot one last thing. We're gonna set the collision channel on our static mesh right here in the collisions. But the collision channel that we want to use doesn't exist right now, so we're just gonna create it. I'm gonna go in Edit and Project Settings. Then I'm gonna go in Collisions on the left, create a new trace channel on the right, which I'm gonna name Grid. And for the default response, I'm gonna make it Ignore. And we can accept. Now that I have my new trace channel, I'm gonna go back in my instance mesh, select my instance mesh, go on the right and scroll down all the way to the collisions, expand the collision preset. I'm gonna change it to custom. I'm gonna make it a collision query only. The object type doesn't really matter, but we're gonna make it a world static. And then we're gonna ignore everything and make sure to block the grid. If the grid channel is not visible right here, it's because you just created and you just have to update it by compiling the blueprint and it should appear right after that. Perfect, now we're done for reals with this blueprint. Okay, now that we're done with the wrapper around the instance static mesh, we're gonna create a new class that we're gonna use to control everything that's related to the grid's visual. So let's go create it. I'm gonna go back in tree, I'm gonna go at the same level as my grid, right click, create a new blueprint class, which is gonna be an actor, which I'm gonna name VP_grid_visual. And open it. Here the first thing I'm gonna do is add a new component of type scene and drag it on top of the root to replace it, just to remove the white dot. And then I'm gonna add another component, which this one's gonna be a child actor. I'm gonna name it child actor underscore grid mesh inst. Then I'm gonna go on the right and set the child actor class, which is gonna be the grid mesh inst that we just created. So by default, this blueprint is going to have another blueprint inside it, which is gonna be the default grid, which is gonna use the grid mesh inst blueprint instead of the instance static mesh component. Okay, we can compile and go in the graph. Same thing as I did for the other blueprint, I'm gonna start by disabling the tick using the set actor tick enable. You can also do it in the class default in the top right corner like here. Okay, now it's time for the functions. I'm gonna create a first one, which I'm gonna name initialize grid visual. And for this function, as input, I'm gonna pass it the grid. So new parameter, BP grid. I'm gonna name it grid. And then I'm gonna right click on it, promote to variable, which I'm gonna name grid also. That way, the grid visual is gonna know which grid it's gonna use to generate the visual. And the grid is only gonna contain the data that's gonna be used by the grid visual. And while we're at it, I'm gonna get the child actor on the left, drop it in the graph, and cast it to the real grid mesh inst. That way we're gonna have access to the real class and not the child actor class parent thingy. And to do that, we have to get child actor first, then we can cast it. So cast to VP grid mesh inst, which I'm going to right click on and click on convert pure cast at the bottom right here. That way it's gonna be a pure node. Then I can right click on the output, promote to a variable, which I'm gonna name grid mesh inst, and connect it after the grid. Now that we have access to the grid and the grid mesh inst, we can initialize the grid mesh inst. So get the grid mesh inst, initialize grid mesh inst, like so, connect them, then we can get the grid, get the current grid shape data right here, we can break it to have access to its content and connect it to the function, so the flat mesh for the mesh and the border material for the material. For the color we're going to keep it black, and for the collision I'm going to make it query only, no physics collision. The next thing we want to do is to center the visual of the grid in the world, the same thing we did for the grid previously, so we're just going to do that, and I'm just going to do it by doing a set actor location, and just connect it like so. I'm going to leave it to 0, 0, 0. And I'm gonna add a little comment, center grid in world. And the last thing we want to do in the initialize function is to adjust the height of the grid, the same way we did in the previous grid, but in this blueprint instead, because the height of the grid, the offset from the ground, I mean, it should be handled in the grid visual instead of inside the grid data. So I'm just going to do it right here. I'm going to create the new function, which is going to be set offset from ground, same thing we had in the previous grid. Then we can add a new input. It's going to be a float. I'm going to name it offset. Promote it to a variable offset from ground. And then we're going to do another set actor location. Connect it after the set. And I'm going to split the new location. And this time I'm going to do a get actor location first. Because we only want this function to affect the z location, not the x and the y as it was doing before. So I'm just going to connect the x and the y back in there, so that way we're not moving them, and use the offset from ground to connect into the z. And now we have to call this function in the initialize. So I'm going to go back in there, grab the set offset from ground, paste it right here, and then we can connect the offset variable to it, which I'm going to compile just to be able to set a value in there, which is going to be 2 by default. Okay, it's now time to create the function that are going to generate the tiles of the grid. So we're going to create a new function, and we're going to start with the easiest one. So destroy grid visual. And for this one, it is easy. I'm going to get the grid mesh inst and do a clear instance on it and connect it to the beginning of the function. Now we want a function that updates the tiles visual. So I'm just going to create a new function, which I'm going to name update tile visual. And we're going to use this function to either add or remove tiles depending if we need them in the grid. But for this function to do its job, it's going to need a few things. It's going to need the tile index, the tile type, and the tile transform. And all these variables are going to be pretty common in the whole project. So we're going to combine them into a structure. I'm going to go back in entry, go in the utilities folder and create a new structure. So blueprint structure. I'm going to name it s_tile data and open it. In here, I'm going to need my 3 variables, so I can create my 2 other ones. And I'm going to start with the index. So the first type is int point, which I'm going to name index. The second one is tile type, so tile type, tile type. I'm going to name it type. And the last one is easy, it's a transform, which I'm going to name transform. We can save it. We can now go back in the grid visual, select our function, and add the variable as input. The type is going to be the structure we just created, so s_tile data. I'm going to name it data, and we can compile to be able to access it. Now I'm going to right click and search for get data and go all the way at the bottom and click on my get data right here. And I'm going to split it. When we're updating a tile in our grid, the first thing we want to do is to remove it from the grid and then spawn it again if we need it at a different location. So I'm going to get my grid mesh inst. I'm going to remove the instance. So remove instance, the function we created at the top here. We can connect it to the start of function and connect the index. And then when we were in the grid, when we were spawning the tiles, we were only spawning the tiles that were walkable, which means that they were not none or not obstacles. And we're going to do the same thing here. But right now, the function that tells us if the grid type is walkable or not is only available in the grid. I could do it like so, grid is tile type walkable, like so, and connect it to my data type. But I would prefer to have it in a function library on the side and use it anywhere, because we don't really need to have access to the grid to know if the type is walkable or not. So we're just going to move that function into a function library instead. So I'm going to start by opening the function since we have it right here, and I'm going to copy the content. I'm going to copy everything. Then I can go back in entry, go in the utilities folder and create the function library. So blueprint function library. This one I'm going to name it bfl_tile data and open it. We are already in a new function, which we can name is tile type walkable, and paste everything we copied 2 seconds ago. And connect it like so, and we can connect the contains to the beginning of the function, which I'm gonna name type. And that's it, the function is created. Oh, actually, we just have to make it pure first. So select the function, check the pure checkbox, and that's it, compile. And now if we go in the grid, we're gonna replace this function. So I'm just going to right click on it, find references, and go where it's used, right here. It's only used at one place, so that's good. I'm just going to call the new function is tile type walkable. The second one, the one that is in BFL tile data, I'm going to click on this one and connect it instead. And now I can simply delete this function from there and delete the function from the left. Now if I compile the grid, everything should work, perfect. We're gonna go back in the grid visual, replace this function right here by the new one, so is tile type walkable, connect it to the data type. I can delete the grid because I don't need it anymore, and I'm gonna do an if on it. And we can finally add the instance. So I'm gonna grab the mesh inst, I'm gonna do an add instance, the call function that we just created, this one, which is gonna need an index and a transform, which we can access from the data. So I can copy it right here, connect the index and the transform, and that's it. We're done with this blueprint for now. We still have a few things to tweak, but we're gonna do it a little bit later. Okay, it's finally time for the fun part, which is connecting all that back in the grid and hope that it works because we changed a lot of things. So let's go do that. I'm gonna go in my grid and I'm gonna start by adding a new component, which is gonna be a child actor. I'm gonna name it the child actor underscore grid visual. Then on the right, I'm going to set the class for the BP grid visual we just created. And I'm gonna go in the construction script to cast it. So construction script, I'm gonna move this out of the way, get my child actor on the left, do a get child actor on it. Then I'm gonna cast to BP grid visual, convert to a pure cast, promote to a variable, which I'm gonna name grid visual, and connect it back to the construction. And since I'm here, I'm just going to reconnect my spawn grid to the beginning, just so we can use it to test. I'm just gonna fix the tile count that is broken and check the use environment. Perfect, let's compile. And it's now time to replace the InstancedStaticMeshComponent everywhere in our code. So I'm just going to right click on it and do a find references. And we're gonna go from the top to the bottom. So let's start with the first one right here. This is where we are initializing the visual of our grid. So we can do that with our grid visual. I'm gonna get the grid visual right here and do a initialize grid visual, which needs a grid as input. And right now we are in the grid blueprint, so we can simply do a self, get reference to self, like so. And we can connect that instead of the two nodes that we had before, delete all of them, and connect this right here. Perfect. We can go to the next one, which is all the way at the end, where we are setting the instances. Well, actually, we're not going to do it that way anymore, so let's just delete all that. And then I'm gonna go back a little bit right here, and we're actually not gonna need any of this anymore either. So let's delete all that. And instead of just spawning the tiles like that, we're gonna start by adding them into a data structures, which we are going to use to keep track of all the tiles that we spawned in the world, and then use them for pathfinding later or anything else. And for this data structure, we're gonna use the style data that we just created, which contains the index, the tile type, and the transform. So I'm gonna go back in the grid, and I'm going to create this data structure. So create a new variable, which I'm gonna name grid tiles. It's gonna contain all the data of all of our tiles. I'm gonna change the type from boolean to a int point for the index of the tile, and then I'm gonna change the container to a map, so we can map the index of the tile to the structure that we just created. So to a map, and instead of an integer right here, I'm going to change it for a style data. And now we're gonna create a functions to add the tiles to the grid tiles. I'm gonna create a new function. I'm gonna name it add grid tile, which is gonna take the data of the tile as input. So style data. I'm gonna name it the data. And then we can get our map right here and do an add on the map. So add the tile, I'm gonna connect it at the beginning of the function. Then if I compile, I have access to my data right here. I'm gonna right click and search for get data, go all the way at the bottom and get the variable. I can connect this to the second pin of my add, and the first pin right here is the int point, which is the index. So I'm just going to duplicate the data, right click, split it to have access to the index and connect the index. So now every time we are adding a grid tile, we are saving them into the grid tile data. And then we can finally display the visual that represents the data and not the opposite. So let's do that. After adding the tile to the grid tiles, we're gonna get the visual and update tile visual. Connect it like so, and it needs the data that we can pass it like so. Perfect. So now the visual is only used to represent the data. Okay, let's go connect this function into our spawn grid function. I'm gonna go back in there. After tracing for the ground, I'm gonna call the add grid tile function like so. I'm gonna right click on data and split the struct pin. For the tile type, we can get it from there. I'm going to split the transform, connect the location like so, the rotation back to the initial transform, and we can have access to the index in our local variables right here. So get the index and connect it right there. Perfect, we can now go to the next instance static mesh right here. Okay, it's the same thing, so let's do the same thing. I'm gonna add the grid tile, I'm gonna split the data, I'm gonna connect it like so. For the tile transform, we have it right here. For the type, we're gonna set it to normal, and the index, well, we have it in the local variables. So let's get it and connect it. We can delete everything else. Okay, now to the next one. It's in destroy grid. Okay, perfect. I'm gonna go here. I'm just gonna delete this because we're not gonna use that. And now when we are destroying the grid, we have to make sure to also destroy the data. So let's just grab it and clear it. Clear. And then we can clear the visual. So get the visual, destroy grid visual, and connect it like so. Perfect. We have one last place that uses the InstancedStaticMeshComponent, and it's in there. It's in the set grid offset from ground function, which we're not going to use anymore. So I'm just going to right click on it and search for find references. Right now this function is only used right here, and we don't need it anymore. So let's just delete it and reconnect the flow like so. Now I should be able to just delete the function on the left. So the set grid offset from ground, I can delete it. Perfect, no complaints, that's good. And I can also delete the variable, so grid offset from ground right here, delete it. And now if I compile, save, okay, perfect, I don't have any error, that's good. I have a little star beside my grid visual, meaning that it's not saved. I'm just going to compile it, making sure that it works, and it works, great. I'm actually going to go back in the grid, and now I think we can delete the instance static mesh. I'm gonna find references. I don't have any references of it anywhere, so I can just delete it also. And now if I compile, save, everything should be fine. No error, no complaints, all good. Okay, let's go see how it looks. I'm gonna go back in tree, and I have a grid, so that's a good start. I have a grid, and it's generated, and it seems fine. It uses the environment, that's good. Okay, now what if I select it and move it? Okay, that's good. It seems to work. It follows the ground. That's great. That's awesome. It works. Great. Okay, now let's try it in game. Play. Oh, bon. I have an error. That's good. Let's open the tab grid. I'm gonna cancel this message, close this log, and we have a few errors. I'm gonna click on the first one. Okay, it tries to set the grid offset from ground. That doesn't exist anymore. So we're gonna just call the function that is inside the grid visual directly. So get the grid, get visual, get grid visual, and then set offset from ground, and we can connect it like so. Perfect, let's compile. Oh, we still have another one. Okay, let's go see that. Okay, same thing, it tries to get the grid offset from ground. Okay, let's get it from the visual. So get grid visual, get offset from ground, and connect it instead. Perfect, let's delete the other one, and now if we compile, it's all good, perfect. Let's go back in the level, press play. Okay, no complaints. I have my grid, and it's generated based on the environment. Oh, that's good, that's great. If I move it, everything seemed to work also. Perfect, I can make it bigger, I can move it a little bit. Okay, everything seemed to work, great. I'm gonna stop. But there's one last thing, actually. If you go in your content browser and you try to add another grid to the world, you have a bunch of warnings, like a ton of them, and it freezes my computer. It's painful. So let's just fix that. I'm gonna delete this new instance, and I'm actually going to look at the log here. Access none, trying to read property, grid mesh inst. Okay, so the grid mesh inst is invalid somewhere. And where is it? It's in grid visual. Okay, good. And it's in the function destroy grid visual. Okay, let's go see that. Grid visual, destroy grid visual, and grid mesh inst here is invalid. Okay, why though? Well, it makes sense, because in my grid here, if I go in my spawn grid function at the beginning, I first start by destroying the grid, and then I initialize the new grid. And the variable that we're trying to access is created inside the initialize grid visual function. So that's why it's not valid yet when we are destroying the grid the first time, because it doesn't exist. But we can't really swap those two functions. We really want to destroy the previous grid and then initialize a new one. So we're just gonna fix that inside the grid visual. So go back in the grid visual and then go in the destroy grid visual function right here. And before trying to clear the instances, we're simply going to check if the variable is valid. So is valid, and then we can connect it. And this is a good solution for us, because if the variable is invalid, well, we don't need to clear the instances because, well, they don't exist yet. So that's good. We don't have any instances to clear, so we don't need to clear them. Perfect. Now we can compile, go back in entry, and try to drag a new grid in the world. And it works. I don't have any warnings in my log, and I can move it around, and it works perfectly. Awesome. And if I go back and play, everything should work as expected. Perfect, great. Okay, I guess that's it for today. We did a lot of stuff, but we didn't change anything actually. That's not that fun, but anyway, that's it for now. I'm really tired and I need to sleep, so I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!